This session is called the Eros Equation, and the Eros Equation is one of the most powerful tools for relationship I've ever encountered, and I'm really passionate about sharing it with you, because one of the things that I do when people send me a Dear Eve question or come to me with a problem is I juxtapose this equation over what they're telling me, and it immediately gives me a recipe, if you will, for helping them find a really great solution. And I want you to be able to be your own best relationship advisor. So with the Eros equation in your tool belt, you'll be able to solve your own relationship problems. Instead of seeking outside for solutions, you'll be able to go inside for solutions to your problems. So before I tell you about the equation, though, I want to share with you a little bit of a story about how I used it in my own life. When I first came to Maui on vacation, something near 25 years ago, I met this beautiful man across the room at a restaurant. I saw him there and I thought, oh, this man is beautiful, handsome, gorgeous. And I decided, as I saw him getting up to leave, or getting ready to pay the bill, that if I didn't go introduce myself to him right now, I would likely never see him again. So I walked over and introduced myself. We started talking. We ended up spending the week getting to know each other. And then I went back to California where I lived, and he remained here on Maui where he lived. We then spent a lot of time on the telephone because, at the risk of making myself sound quite old, this was before the internet, and it was before email, it was before cell phones were common, and we had really no other way to communicate other than the good old-fashioned letter writing, which was far too long in between, or getting on the telephone and talking. So we started talking to each other and exploring the relationship deeper and trying to figure out what to do, because I didn't want to move to Maui to be with him if I wasn't pretty sure he was the right guy. I didn't want to uproot my life for just another guy for just another little while. And he didn't want me to move here to be with him unless I was the right gal. He'd been there and done that, and it's a lot easier to move him in than move him out. And so he wanted to take this more mindfully and consciously as well. So here we were on the phone saying, well, what do we do now? There's no way for us to date to find out if we like each other more than we already think we do. So we decided to start asking each other questions and really explore our values, our interests, our lifestyles, our goals, all of the things that become important in a relationship and in one's life. So we started asking each other questions, and that's how our book Intellectual Foreplay was born. It's full of questions we explored with each other, and we asked other people, what do I need to know before I get seriously involved? And everybody had an answer. You need to ask him this, you need to ask her that. So then we'd write them all down, we'd get on the phone, and we'd ask each other these questions. So that went on for several months. I think 5 months we were apart. And then I moved to Maui. We got engaged shortly thereafter, and we got married 6 months later. So now it was a full year into the relationship we got married. And everything went along really well for a while. In fact, several years. It was going great. But then something happened, and it started not being great. And if you watched the ego dance, the way I would explain it to you is that when I met him, I was feeling pretty authentic and like I didn't ever need a relationship, and was feeling pretty happy with my life on my own and wasn't looking for a partner. And then I saw this beautiful man across the room, and I wanted him. And when I went into wanting him, my ego got triggered. How could I get him to love me? And I got triggered by my need for approval. And he, who has an automatic MO of need for control, met that beautifully, and we just connected, no problem. And everything went fine for a while. But as I shared with you before, when you're operating from a need for approval and you keep moving further and further and further away from yourself, eventually you find yourself discontent. And that's what happened to me. I adopted his lifestyle, his food habits, his household. I moved into his house. I adopted his friends, his hobbies, and I moved away from my home, my family, my friends, and all of my support system. And eventually I started feeling like I didn't know who I was, and I didn't have my life, and I found myself resentful, and I wasn't happy, and I was blaming him. And instead of becoming authentic, as I would guide anyone now to do, I simply switched my magnet around and started attacking him. You're not making me happy. This isn't working for me. And became somebody that I'm sure was not much fun to live with. He went here for a second. What do you mean? I don't want you to leave. And then he went right into his need for control, and now we were duking it out. And it wasn't working at all. And the problem is that the ego, when it's triggered, goes ballistic. So my ego was going ballistic and it was feeling trapped. I was looking around and thinking, I can't leave no matter what because we have a house together. I can't leave. We have a business together. We have a dog. We have a cat. I left my job and my family. I had the big wedding and worse yet, and this is the worst of all, I wrote the book on finding the right partner. You want to feel trapped in a relationship, that's a great way to do it. So here I am feeling trapped in the relationship, and the more trapped I feel, the more ego triggered I get. And now it's just not working at all. One night, in the middle of the night, around 4 o'clock in the morning, I sat bolt right up in bed and went, there is nothing worth being miserable about. Nothing. And I actually got out of bed and walked around the house and I went, he can have the house. He can have the dog. He can have the cat. He can have the business. Any money we have. I'll just start a new career. It doesn't matter. None of those external trappings are worth my internal misery. And I'm standing in my living room, just having cut my tie to all the excuses and all the things I was blaming for me being in the situation I was in, when suddenly that little voice in my head said, okay, well, now that that's over, the front door's right there. You're welcome to walk out of it. And all of a sudden, I found myself thinking, well, I don't want to walk out of it, not right now. And it was very disconcerting because up until then, I couldn't walk out and was angry about that. Now I could walk out and I didn't want to. And what I liken that to is up until then, I was caught in my ego mind thinking the only solution is to get out. When I suddenly dropped into a moment of where I could get out, I didn't want to because there was a deeper reason why. And I didn't know what that was at first. I said, okay, wait a minute, let me look at this. Why am I not jumping at the opportunity to walk out that door right now? And that's when I took a deeper look and self-observed and looked at myself, looked at the choices, looked at my behaviors, looked at my husband, and I realized that he was a really good man, and I really had done my homework in choosing him. We spent quite a lot of time exploring all of our values and our beliefs and our ways of being, and we were compatible and in alignment. So that wasn't it. And then I realized that I had not been practicing the concepts that I teach. I think somewhere along the line, I kind of fell asleep, my ego took over, and I just started doing what everybody else does in relationship and jumped into the ego dance and seen only the solutions outside of myself instead of looking inside for the solutions. And in that moment, I had this soul-searching, middle-of-the-night talk with myself about what I wanted to do. And I decided to take a tool that I had learned from Jack Canfield that he calls E plus R equals O. And I added an S on and made it E plus R equals O and S, and I'll tell you what that means in a minute, and made it the Eros equation. But I decided to take this tool that he had shared with me and see if I applied it in my life, if I could actually turn my world around. And what his concept is that we need to take 100% responsibility for our happiness. 100%. You can imagine this makes the ego mind go ballistic because the ego doesn't want to take any responsibility. It wants to blame everybody else. But responsibility, if you watch the ego dance, you know, is the secret ingredient to switching from the ego mind into the authentic spirit. And I thought, okay, if I take 100% responsibility for what's going on here, and I take this Eros equation that I learned from Jack and added to, and I apply that, I want to see if I can literally turn this ship, which is heading straight on into all the icebergs there are, can I turn this ship around and fall back in love with my husband? Now, I want you to understand that at this moment in time, we'd had so much of this ego dance that I didn't feel like I was in love with him anymore. I loved him. I was not in love with him. And I didn't know if it was possible to fall back in love because in my experience in all previous relationships, when this happened, we split up and we never tried to fall back in love again. So I'd never had any frame of reference for whether it was even possible to fall back in love with someone. So I didn't believe it was possible. I didn't know it was possible. But at this point, I figured, what do I have to lose? I have this tool, this Eros equation, which I even had in my first book. So it was clear that I knew about it, had it already in my tool belt. I just wasn't using it for whatever reason, had this blind spot. What if I took this tool, applied it to my relationship, and see if I can turn it around? in the worst case scenario, it wouldn't work and my relationship would be over, and then I literally would walk out the door. And that was one option. In the best case scenario, I might discover that I actually am 100% responsible for my happiness and able to turn my relationship around and hit the mark of having a loving, harmonious relationship. And if that were the case and that were the end result, I would also have tested this material that I was pretty passionate about sharing with people and see if it really works when the real caca hits the fan, not just with the little stuff. So I decided to see what I could do. So I took the Eros equation and I applied it in my relationship. But right there in that moment at 4 o'clock in the morning, I decided I had to have an end time period, because if I just said, I'm going to try again, my ego went ballistic. It's like, try again, we've tried already. And it just makes up all these excuses why it won't work. So I said, okay, ego, I'm going to try for 6 months. And what I'm going to try is to see what happens when I take 100% responsibility for what I say, what I do, the stories I make up, so what I choose to think, and how I be, and the end result of that is how I feel. So all my words, all my thoughts, and all my actions, I was going to take 100% responsibility for. See if I could align them with who I really am, and remember that, because I had clearly forgotten, and with what I was trying to create, and simultaneously remembering that, because I had also forgotten that what I wanted was a healthy, harmonious, loving, intimate connection with my partner. So I gave myself 6 months. Now here's the interesting part. I chose not to tell him, because I felt that if I told him I'm giving this relationship 6 months, that some conscious or unconscious part of me would be saying, I'm giving you 6 months, buddy, to get your act together, and there would be some expectation that he do something different. One of the things, bless his soul and all his wisdom, when we were duking it out, that he said to me, which I had to admit was true, he said, Eve, who I was when you met me, who I was when you fell in love with me, who I was when you married me, and who I was when you stopped liking me was the same guy. I have not changed. And with that awareness, I had to realize that I had changed. And I was creating the problem in my relationship with my belief system. Now, who I was as a person hadn't changed. Who I was authentically hadn't changed. How I was operating had changed. And rather than operating from my authentic self, or my need for approval even, I was now operating from my need for control. And that's like wearing lenses in your glasses, where the other person can do nothing right. He comes home from work, that's not right. He sits down, that's not right. He leaves his dish out, that's not right. He puts his dish away, he doesn't do it right. The ego mind, when it gets caught up in the ego need for control, nobody can do anything right. So I began applying the Eros equation in my relationship, taking 100% responsibility for what I did, what I said, and what I thought, and the energetic with which I did it. And everything turned around so quickly it made my head swim. I'm pretty sure that from my husband's perspective, honeymoon was on, honeymoon was off, and when we're duking it out and fighting, and then honeymoon was back on for real. And he never really knew what had happened. He just was, it was me. It was the way I was showing up. So the Eros equation is a super powerful tool, and that's what I applied in combination with this mindfulness of the insights to self that you've already had, that awareness of who I really am, and the difference between that and the oil and the glitter or the ego mind, and the 6 essential life skills, which are how you bring yourself back into alignment. Remembering who you really are and what you're trying to create, being self-observant, and then choosing which way you want to go, recalibrating with who you are, and aligning your words, thoughts, and actions with what your target is. So I decided to identify. I already knew who I was. I had simply forgotten. So for me, it was just remembering who I am and what I value and what I stand for and what I believe in. And then I needed to identify my target. And in this case, I wanted to see if I could align with creating a healthy, loving, harmonious, intimate relationship. That was my target. So my next marching orders, if you will, were to align all my words, all my thoughts, and all my actions between those two things. So the Eros equation. Eros is spelled E-R-O-S, and in the Greek mythology, Eros is the god of love. And so by adding the S on the end, it made it the love equation. And what it stands for is the E stands for event. And what events are is everyone else and everything external. So absolutely everything outside of you. It's the things the ego sees. Somebody calls you a name, that's an event. You get a flat tire, that's an event. Your battery's dead in your car, that's an event. It rains, that's an event. Everything that happens outside of you, that's really outside of your focus of control, is an event. The things that happen. The R stands for response, so it's E plus R, so the event plus the response equals the O, which is outcome, and the S, which is the solution. So the event plus the response equals the outcome and the solution. Now what this means is the response is how we respond to whatever happens. That's what we say, what we think, what stories we make up, how do we respond to those things. The outcome is how we end up feeling, the result of all of that. And the solution is that target that we want to aim for. The interesting part about this is that most of us from the ego mind spend all our time trying to change the event. We look outside of us at our problems, and we look outside of us for solutions, and we think if only that event over there would change, if only that event would change, if that event would change, if everyone and everything would behave the way I think it should, everything would be fine. The problem is I have no control over you, and it doesn't work. And interestingly, when I look at what people come to me with relationship issues, they come to me, they say, in essence, in some semblance of this, Dear Eve, Mr. or Mrs. Event, my husband, my wife, my child, my mother, my neighbor, my father, my kids, whoever, Mr. or Mrs. Event is behaving this way. How can I get them to behave differently? How can I change that event so that I can feel this outcome and this solution? And they completely disregard the response part. So I come back to them and I peel away the layers and I say, Mr. or Mrs. is behaving this way. Mr. So-and-so, Mrs. So-and-so is behaving in such a way that you are responding to it in such a way that it's leading to the outcome that you're experiencing. And if you change your response, it will lead to the solution that you desire. So for instance, my neighbor is behaving this way and it's causing me to be angry and upset and frustrated. How can I get my neighbor to do something different so I can be happy? Then I come back and say, your neighbor's behaving this way and you're responding in such a way that it's causing you to be angry and upset. How can you respond in a new way so that you can feel the solution? You can experience a solution. And essentially what I'm doing is asking people to peel away the ego blinders of I'm only going to be happy if somebody else does something different, and step into your immense creativity and capability and power for seeing other solutions and other possibilities so that you can create a different end result and potentially and hopefully move in the direction of your target. So that's what I did in my relationship. I went, okay, let me juxtapose this on my relationship just for the sake of exercise to see if this works. My husband is the event. Everything he does, everything he says, everything I've criticized, everything I've loved, everything is an external event, and I have no control over that. So I'm going to stop every time I catch myself thinking I have power over changing the event. I'm going to stop and bring myself back into balance and look at what my response to those things are and see if I can take control of those. This is where it gets juicy and exciting and a field of possibility. So I've looked at this thing of the response inside and outside, upside and backwards, and figured out that we basically have 4 response options when an event is behaving a certain way that we perhaps don't like. Let's say the example is, or the event is, that my husband doesn't do dishes by way of example. So that would be the event. My husband doesn't do dishes. Now I basically have 4 response options on what to do about that. Typically, the first response option that we all employ is negotiation. We aim to negotiate to get the event to change. And that's a viable and valid place to start, but I want you to remember that anytime you're focused on getting the event to change, you're turning your power over to them for your happiness. and you are no longer in charge of your own well-being. So in this example, if I said to my husband, hey babe, on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, would you do the dishes? Or when I cook, would you clean? That's a negotiation, and it's a viable place to start. But the challenge is my power for my happiness is outside of myself, requiring that the event change in order for me to be happy. And so on Monday when he does the dishes, I'm happy. On Wednesday when he does the dishes, I'm happy. On Friday, when he's too tired and doesn't feel like doing the dishes, I'm now unhappy. And the interesting part about that, and women will get this, men maybe not so much, it might be shocking to you, is that I'm unhappy times 3. I'm unhappy because the dishes didn't get done. I'm unhappy because he said he would do the dishes and he didn't do them, so he broke his word. But this is the one that screws up relationships every time, and the one that usually other people don't know about. And that is the story in my own head that I'm making up, the meaning that I'm making about what it means about me and our relationship that he didn't do the dishes. And typically what we do is we go, well, if he really loved me, he would have done the dishes. If he respected me, he would have done the dishes. We make up some story and attach value to it as if it is the truth, and then we react with the vehemence of not being loved or respected. And the husband or the other person is going, whoa, I just didn't want to do the dishes tonight. I'll do them tomorrow. What's the problem? But we're jumping down their throat, or vice versa, over the story we're telling ourselves about what we thought it meant. So negotiation is a viable place to start, but I want you to understand it's still an attempt to change the event. It may work or it may not work. Sometimes people want to change, but they can't. Sometimes they're addicted to something and they haven't been able to break that cycle. Sometimes they don't want to change and we're asking something of them that they don't want to do. And sometimes they simply just forget, and it may take years for them to remember in breaking a habit that we don't like putting the toilet seat down or putting the lid down. It might take somebody years after 30 or 40 years of leaving it up to remember to put it back down. So even though they want to, and even though they agree and they're willing, it may not be something they do right away. So we have to give them a little latitude for that in recognizing all requests to change the event put our power outside of us for our happiness. So option number 2. This is what 99.9% of the planet is doing all the time. It might even be 100% of the planet, but I don't want to be that complete in this assumption. What this one is that we are resisting what is, but we're staying in the relationship anyways. So that's where we don't like what the other person's doing. We've tried to change it possibly through negotiation or outright requesting, and it hasn't worked. So we can't figure out how to consciously change the event. So this is when the ego gets triggered. I don't like that my husband doesn't do the dishes, but I haven't been able to figure out how to get him to do the dishes by asking. So the ego thinks, in its effort to protect me and make sure that I'm not the only one doing the dishes, that it's going to figure out a way. And that's where the ego starts employing all kinds of unskilled and unconscious attempts to change the event. And we're still trying to change the event, this thing outside of us, but we're doing it in unskilled and unconscious ways. Not always unconscious, but often unconscious. And that's where we employ the ego need for approval and the ego need for control and start doing all kinds of things that lead in the absolute opposite direction of what we want to create. We employ behaviors like nagging or sarcasm or gestures. That's one of my favorites. Rolling the eyes, making snide facial expressions. Sometimes it's passive-aggressive. I go in the kitchen and I do the dishes, but I clank them loudly so that he knows that I'm mad, that I'm the one doing them. Or maybe we do some kind of revenge or retaliation where, fine, I won't do the dishes either, and we pile them up in a passive-aggressive attempt to retaliate. Sometimes the response option when we're resisting what is, but staying in the relationship and letting our ego run the ship, to use an analogy I've shared with you previously, is we will do things like withdrawal. Fine, I'm just going to pull away. I'm going to give you the silent treatment. I'm stop making love with you. I'm going to stop being kind and caring. I'm going to just disappear. I might even flatline. And we withdraw from the relationship. it gets nasty. Sometimes we start fighting, and sometimes it gets really nasty. What I want you to understand is that in the event plus response equals outcome and solution equation, is the event was that my husband didn't do the dishes. My response was to allow my ego to run the ship. The outcome was an absolute decimation of the relationship, and we crashed right into the iceberg that I didn't want. Because the truth of the matter is, if I'm being controlling and operating from my control and approval drama in an attempt to get him to do the dishes, it seldom ever works. He doesn't do the dishes because I'm controlling and mean and nasty. He doesn't ever go, wow, Eve is being so horrible. I think I'll do the dishes for her. That's not the outcome that it usually leads to. It usually leads to that we're now in a fight and the dishes didn't get done. And what I want people to recognize is that if we want the dishes to get done and we want to have a harmonious, loving relationship, we need to do something different. So to bring this back to the conversation about the target that we had in the 6 Essential Life Skills session, I want you to imagine that if the target was getting the dishes done and it was way out here on my target, but my core bullseye is to be in integrity and self-mastery with what I teach, and to have loving, harmonious relationships with the people closest to me, which is definitely my husband, and I'm focusing on getting the dishes done, but I am decimating my relationship in the process, I am absolutely missing my mark. And I'm not just missing the mark of my healthy, harmonious relationships, but I'm also not getting the dishes done. It's illogical. It doesn't work. Unfortunately, this is what a huge percentage of us are doing, is we are doing things, saying things, and thinking things that lead in the absolute opposite direction of what we're trying to create. And as an outcome, it is never what we want. So what do we do instead? I'm going to skip option number 3 for just a second and move to option number 4, which is to get out of the relationship. And that's an option, certainly. But my experience is that if we get out of the relationship from this ego dance of resistance, we take that energy with us into every future relationship. Not only is that breakup nasty, but the next relationship doesn't stand a chance, because the first guy I date who leaves his cup out is going to get all of the energies of all my frustration over many years of doing the dishes previous. So we take that baggage with us into the next relationship. And not only that, but there are some things that just do not merit getting out of a marriage over, and dishes is one of them. It's pretty embarrassing. Oh, why'd you and your husband split up? Because he doesn't do the dishes. That just doesn't really jive. So what do I do instead? Living miserably didn't work so well. That was the path of resistance. Negotiation, that didn't work so well. It didn't work. Didn't matter what I said. The dishes don't get done. I don't want to get out over it because that seems silly. So what do I do instead? And this is one of the questions I love to pose to couples that I work with. If living miserably were not an option and divorce were not an option, what would you do? And the most amazing thing happens when we realize that changing the other person is not an option, living miserably is not an option that we're okay with, and getting out is not an option. Then the only thing that's left is to look for other solutions. And that's what option number 3 comes down to, is number 3 is to accept what is, to accept the event as it is, or acknowledge that the event is as it is, and then step into our authenticity to reveal our creativity so that we can see other solutions that lead toward what we want to create. To go back to the example of the dishes, if the event is that my husband doesn't do dishes, and I choose to, instead of resisting that, accept that my husband doesn't do dishes, suddenly a whole lot of other possibilities come into mind. One is that I can simply accept that he doesn't do the dishes and realize that I don't mow the lawn and he spends as much time mowing the lawn as I do doing the dishes each week, and just move into peace with that instead of resistance. That's an option. It's called division of labor, and it's been going on for centuries. So I could just let go of it as an issue. But if that's not okay with me, if I really don't want to be the one who does the dishes all the time, I could look into getting paper plates on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, or going out to eat on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, or hiring someone to help us, or getting takeout on those days, or on Monday using paper plates, on Wednesday hiring somebody, and on Friday going out to eat. my invitation there is to see what my other possibilities are besides trying to change him and get him to do what I want him to do. And how I know this is possible is that if my husband were to come home and have an accident and broke both hands or broke both arms and was in a cast and couldn't wash dishes, I would find a solution without being angry at him. Or if he had an allergy to soap and couldn't do the dishes, I would find a solution without being angry at him. And so my invitation to you is to take a deeper look and say, wow, if I let go of these ego blinders that the other person must change, how can I do something different that brings about a different result? It becomes immensely powerful. You know, they say that in the olden days, I don't even know if it's olden days, they may still do it now, that raccoon hunters would drill a hole in a log, put a shiny penny in, and then when the raccoon comes walking down the log, it sees the shiny penny, reaches in, and then can't get its hand out, and all the raccoon has to do, or the hunter has to do, is come along and shoot the raccoon, when all the raccoon has to do to be free is to let go of the shiny penny. But they never do. They get caught up in this thing, obsessed with it, and they hold on to it till death do they part. And my experience is that we kind of do the same thing when it comes to relationship issues if we're letting our ego mind run the ship. We let our ego say, this is wrong, he should do this is wrong, she should do that, they should behave this way, they need to do this differently, and we get so caught up in that as the shiny penny that we don't see any other solutions that would set us free. So the invitation is to drop in and say, what if I accepted that this is the way this person is? And then see if I can do something different. Sometimes the other person is the way they are because of the ego magnet that we're holding up all the time and they're reacting to. And that if we simply shift how we show up, they may shift how they show up in relationship to us. John Bradshaw, who wrote the book On the Family, said that relationships and families were like a mobile where we're all hanging in perfect balance. And if I'm on the same mobile with you and I want you to shift and change, I can't make you change from over here because I'm too far away. I can't reach you. But if I shift where I am on the mobile, if I change my behavior and shift my behavior, you will automatically shift in order to stay in relationship with me. And I suddenly realized in my effort to put this Eros equation to work in my relationship, how true that was. If I came home and was judgmental of my husband, he would react to that. If I came home and was loving to my husband, he would react to that. Other people are incredibly responsive. And when we realize what power we hold in our hands for how we show up and how that will create a dynamic in which other people rise to meet us, or we will become very clear we can't be in relationship with them anymore. We become immensely powerful. So I invite you to start looking at the Eros equation and what you've been doing, what you've been looking at externally, and then how you've been responding, and see if you can find new ways to respond that bring about a different outcome. Let me give you another example. When my husband and I were writing our book, Intellectual Foreplay, we actually started gathering questions from other people about what they thought we should ask before we got seriously involved. And we started asking everybody, what do we need to know? And this one woman I was working with said, you need to ask him whether he likes the lights bright or dim in the bathroom. And I thought, really? I need to know that? Why do I need to know that? And she went on to explain to me that she and her husband were in the midst of a major fight, and she actually said they were on the verge of divorce because every morning they got up, they went into the bathroom to get ready for work. She liked the lights bright because she was putting on makeup, and he liked the lights dim because he was a slow waker-upper, and every morning they got in a fight in the bathroom, to the verge of almost being divorced on account of it. Now, they thought the problem was the lights. But I know, and now you know, that the problem was actually the ego mindset and the ego dance that they were holding up. That belief system that you have to like it the way I like it, you have to like it the way I like it, is as silly as saying just because chocolate ice cream's my favorite, that it has to be yours. And just because you like the lights bright doesn't mean I do, and just because you like the lights dim doesn't mean I do. We need to find a way to make this work for both of us. And so when I heard them sharing this, I thought how funny when we get caught in that resistance. In option number 2, they were resisting what is and trying to make the other person change. They went down the path that was destroying their relationship. But when you shift and you drop into acceptance, my partner likes the lights bright, or my partner likes the lights dim, all of a sudden, all these other possibilities open up of what you could do instead that would lead toward a solution that worked for both of you. And I'm guessing because you were not caught in the middle of this ego dance that they were, just in listening to this, that you've probably thought of 2 or 3 solutions already. Why didn't they get a bathroom with 2 different light settings and use it at 2 different times? Why didn't they move into a house with 2 different bathrooms? Why didn't they put a makeup mirror in another part of the room? You know, there's so many things that we can think of that would cause a more harmonious outcome for them than duking it out and trying to change the other person, trying to change the event. But when you're caught in the ego drama and you're caught in the ego dance, it's very difficult to see this unless you take a more mindful, self-observant state and go, oh, this is what I'm doing, and put the Eros equation over it. Realize when you're trying to change the event, you've disempowered yourself, and you're also communicating dissatisfaction with your partner, which isn't a very pleasant thing to have communicated. And see if you can find a way where you reconnect with your power and your source for bringing about a different result in the relationship, a different outcome, and leads to a different solution. I'll give you another example. I was doing a live TV show here on the local public access television, and a guest called in and said, Eve, I can't tell whether my husband's not listening to me or whether he's deaf. And so again, just to remind you, I always juxtapose the Eros equation over what people tell me to see if I can help them find a more powerful way to solve the problem. So I looked at that and I said, okay, let's see. The event is that your husband's not listening to you, or not hearing you. That's the event. And we don't know whether he's deaf or whether he's just not listening. So let's take a look at your responses. I asked her, if your husband were deaf and that were the event, how would you respond? And she said, if he's deaf, I'm going to be loving and understanding and helpful, and I'm going to make sure that he knows when I'm communicating with him, and I'll go out of my way to really be helpful and loving and kind. And that would lead toward this solution. I said, okay, great. Now, what would you do if you knew that your husband was not listening to you? And she immediately went down this path of resistance and said, well, I would be angry and I would be, fighting with him and I would be upset. And she went down this path that led absolutely into the iceberg of destroying their relationship. So I simply said to her, then pretend that he's deaf. And I say that because even though it sounds funny, people go, well, wait a minute, what if he wasn't listening to her? I want you to remember that this is your soul's journey. This is your life, and alignment with who you really are and what you want to create is your job, nobody else's. And if we make whether somebody else is deaf or not listening to us, or somebody says something nice or something unkind, if we make everything outside of ourselves responsible for who we are, we're going to be victims of this planet, and we're not going to be powerful at all. When we say it doesn't matter whether he's deaf or he's not listening, that what matters is whether I'm a kind and loving, caring person, or if I'm an argumentative, unpleasant person, and we take responsibility for that and align from here, amazingly things may turn around. If he is not listening and you start behaving kind and loving, you might find he rises to meet you there and starts listening. And if he is actually deaf, that choice is still the right one as well. So it becomes this process of what can I do differently? How can I respond differently? What can I do to turn this situation around? Now with the Eros equation, I like to point out that these examples are pretty simple ones. They don't do dishes, they're not listening. They're common, but they're simple. But what about the bigger, deeper issues when the event is that your partner is using drugs or addicted to substances, or your partner is abusive, or your partner is gambling away your life savings? What if they're those big issues like that, or your partner is cheating on you and that's the event? We still need to come back into balance with these response options to determine what to do. Anytime we're negotiating to try to get them to do it differently, it's viable. Go ahead and try. See if it works. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it doesn't. So give it a shot. But if it doesn't work, then be super mindful about what your next choice is. Because what almost everybody does is we go into resistance. We let our ego get triggered. I'm mad that they didn't stop cheating. I'm angry that they didn't get over that addiction, or they didn't stop gambling. And I'm mad about that. And they should stop. And then we start doing all of those behaviors of resistance, which lead to the arguing, the nagging, the passive-aggressive behaviors, the fighting. It leads toward crashing smack dab into the iceberg that we don't want, and destroys not only the relationship, but our own happiness in the meantime. We can get out, but if we get out from that ego drama, all we've done is charge our baggage up and batteries up and magnet up, and it discharges in other places where we don't want it. So instead, I invite you to go back into that state. Use the 6 essential life skills. Remember who you really are, what you're trying to create. And in this case, it may not be a harmonious relationship. Maybe you're ready to end this relationship. But in this case, you're going to want to do so with integrity and self-mastery so that you have complete ability to manage your own ship. And you have the ability to navigate these waters of breaking up or divorce or whatever you need to do in a healthy way that leads toward the least harm for all involved. When you drop into that state of being, remembering who you really are and what you're trying to create, and you become self-observant, and you watch what you're saying, what you're doing, and what you're thinking, and align them with your solution that you're aiming for, you'll create much more powerful results. So even if you do need to get divorced, or even if you do need to break up, you do so from this very mindful place of recognizing that the event is what it is. If that person's going to cheat, or that person's going to gamble, or that person's going to have an addiction, that's their life journey and that's their choice, and you really have no control over it. You've tried. It didn't work. So now you have to look at what you're going to do. And that's when you shift into a place of acceptance and acknowledgement. My partner is a drug addict. My partner is not ready for a monogamous relationship. My partner is a gambler, or whatever the truth may be. And then decide what you want to do, leading your ship from your spirit, working your way through navigating these waters with the most access to your highest self, knowing where you're trying to go so that you don't crash smack dab into the iceberg and decimate the relationship and your own sense of self and mastery and wellness and integrity at the same time. The relationship may not survive, but you want to make sure that you do. And that's where this work will help you, is bringing yourself back into balance, bringing yourself recalibrating with who you really are, and then choosing the responses in alignment with who you are and what you're trying to create. And you will discover that when you apply the Eros equation, this is powerful work in every area of your life. It doesn't matter if you're doing the Eros equation at work, the Eros equation with your children, the Eros equation with your sweetheart, your Eros equation just in response to things that happen in your life. When you take the ego blinders off and start looking at your capacity and your creativity for finding solutions for navigating these challenging waters and making choices and taking responsibility for what you say, what you do, and what you think, so that your choices are leading toward what you want, the outcome and the solution that you desire, you will become immensely powerful over all your relationships, and you'll stop being a victim and start being a victor in all that you do.